This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by Tony Black. Hi Tony, how are you?
Hi Duncan, I'm not too bad, thanks. It's nice to be back on for another episode names episode. You've gone through quite a few since we were on last, I think.
You've managed to dip out of quite a few of these, yeah. I mean, this is the series that you and I came up with that we thought would be a sort of, a light little diversion and seems to have kind of expanded into a kind of monstrous behemoth. But we're kind of hopefully, touch wood, nearing the end. Yeah. Certainly with this episode, we're kind of picking up towards the end of Voyager and we're hoping to blitz through back to the Alpha Quadrant and then get through Enterprise in this episode, and then that'll just leave all the kind of more modern treks to come. Yeah, we'll see if we get there, but we'll give it our best shot.
We will.
Which means I think the first episode I had from where Lee and I left off last time was the Voyager episode Tinker Tenor Doctor Spy. This is a fantastic title, I think, on several levels, and obviously picking up from the John le Carré novel.
Yeah, 1974, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. This is probably one of his. It might be le Carré's most famous book, I think, about George Smiley, the spy master who uncovers a Russian mole in the British Secret Service. Have you read this? I've read bits. I've got it, and I've read bits of it, and I have seen the latest film adaptation, but I've never read the whole thing. I don't know if you have.
I have to say, I've neither read it nor seen either film, either the TV series or the film, and I understand all three of them are masterpieces and wonderful. And I am intending to one day, not least because I have an idea that we might do a sort of le Carré Garrick sort of crossover episode of Primitive Culture at some point. But no, I haven't. It's taken, I think, from a nursery rhyme as well. The title is from an old nursery rhyme. According to Wikipedia, Tinker Tailor is a counting game, nursery rhyme and fortune-telling song traditionally played in England that can be used to count cherry stones, buttons, daisy petals and other items. It has a rude folk song index number of 802.
Okay.
For those interested in that kind of thing. The most common version is Tinker Tailor, Soldier, Sailor, Rich Man, Poor Man, Beggar Man, Thief.
Right, okay.
The most common American version is Rich Man, Poor Man, Beggar Man, Thief, Doctor, Lawyer or Merchant, Indian Chief.
I think I've heard that one. I've heard that one more than the British one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the Doctor is kind of in there. It just sort of struck me. I mean, I love this episode. I think it's a great episode of Voyager. I think it's a clever title. Does the fact that when you say Tinker, well, okay, that doesn't say Taylor, Tinker Tenor, but you establish Tinker Tailor, the le Carré / BBC TV adaptation or whatever at this stage. The word that is sort of latent in that is soldier. And is there something of that this is the episode where the Doctor, as well as the sort of spy element and so on, and obviously he's tinkering with his program and he's singing and so on, that he is kind of seeing himself in a military role. Do you know what I mean? Is that word soldier kind of almost there in the unconscious of the reference somehow?
Oh, maybe it could be. It could be part of the fact that towards the end of Voyager, they start giving him a lot more of these kind of focused episodes. It feels like that they're trying to make him into an unusual kind of if not heroic, then combative main character in some respects. And I think they just like the pun of it. Really, I think this seems to be one of those classic sort of let's do a play on. Although I don't know if Trek really did a lot of these kind of on the nose sort of pun titles, though, did they? This sounds like something you get from Michael Giacchino's albums for Trek movies, doesn't it? Really, that kind of playful title.
It's quite a sort of cheeky one, I suppose, isn't it? It's quite a sort of it's a jokey title. I mean, it's a jokey episode. It's a funny episode, but it's a very I was going to say frivolous. That's not quite the right word, but it's a sort of winking jokey title, and it's a reference to something that doesn't have much to do with the story, except that it's a kind of clever kind of play on words in a way. The next episode I had is a very straightforward one, Alice. Now, I was always very puzzled by this episode, and I was also always very puzzled by the title. And I think the only explanation for the title is when you realise, as Brandon Shamatella explained to me, that this episode of Voyager is based on the Stephen King novel Christine. And Brandon and I did an episode of Primitive Culture way back, looking at this episode and the novel and the film as well, and talking about that because he's a massive John Carpenter fan, and Christine, the movie, is a big John Carpenter movie. And I suppose it's slightly odd, to be honest, that that's the name of the Stephen King novel even. This is a novel about a murderous car. Insofar as, it's just this female, it doesn't tell you anything. Do you know what I mean? It's a name that kind of tells you almost nothing. I suppose he'd done the same with Carrie, and we kind of, we know what that represents, if you know what I mean. But Alice, it's a weird one. It's not going to be Alice in Wonderland. It's not, it's not really alluding to anything with the name Alice. It's just that there's that kind of parallel there with the source material.
But that would be your instinct, though, wouldn't it? To imagine this is a play on like Lewis Carroll, or it's about a character sort of going down maybe a rabbit hole, and going into like a fantasy world or something like. Alice is definitely going to bring up that Wonderland sort of connotation. But in this case, they were clearly going for a Christine-esque sort of name, weren't they? I think with Christine, the whole, and I haven't read the book, but I've seen the movie, and I did enjoy the film. And it's been a lot. I have listened to the podcast with Brandon, and it was quite a while ago now, so it's not fresh in my mind. But I think generally the idea of the name Christine is that the film and the story is sort of set, partly back in the 1950s, and the car is sort of named after, Christine might be the name of the girl next door, in the 1950s Americana. So I think it's a very innocuous name for what turns out to be a very scary, car in this case. So I think that's what they were trying to get with Alice, weren't they? That kind of juxtaposition between something that's a bit crazy or scary and something that's very homely and that kind of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Not a great episode, I have to say, but I do think once you see it as a kind of Stephen King riff, it at least gives it a little bit more bite somehow.
Yeah.
Speaking of bites, the next episode that I had on my list was Dragon's Teeth.
Oh, that's a good one.
This is one where the reference is actually helpfully explained by Chakotay in the episode. He does a kind of reprise of his Scorpion story from Scorpion, and here he explains the title Dragon's Teeth. He's kind of obviously the guy to rely on when you need your episode title explained. But this is originally from Greek mythology, I think. I think Chakotay just says it was a sort of mythical story. This idea that the teeth of the dragon that was slain would be sort of planted around and spring up into warriors, obviously relating to this situation, as Chakotay kind of comments in the episode, of these, what are they like in stasis or whatever, these terrifying characters, the Vardwa, who even look sort of slightly dragonish themselves with their kind of scaly makeup and so on. So I think a great episode. It's one of those real, what might have been for Voyager, because they seemed like this fantastic villainous race that they brought in and then never returned to again. And I know that Star Trek Online has used them. I'm sure the novels have used them. They're kind of, they're almost a bit of a gift, but they, for whatever reason, they didn't go back to that one. So having planted the dragon's teeth, they didn't let them germinate, or whatever it is that you expect them to do to create more and more drama along the line.
Yeah, well, I believe this was supposed to be a two-parter as well, wasn't it? At some point, it was supposed to be much more fleshed out. And that's the thing; it's a really evocative title. It's a really interesting title. I wonder which came first. Did they happen upon this myth and this this legend and then think, oh, that's a good idea for a title? Or did it sort of, come together and fit? Either way, it does work. It sort of, it suggests real menace. It suggests a real sense of scale. And he's evocative and mythical. Yeah, it's really good. It's just a shame. Yeah, like you say, they didn't do more with the Vardoir and built. Well, it's Voyager to a T, isn't it? Didn't do enough with the good stuff they had. Didn't even make a 2-part episode, and yet we got a 2-parter for Workforce, which I find one of the most baffling decisions in Voyager history. Just to go back to the original legends, these dragon's teeth featured prominently, this is from Wikipedia again, in the legends of the Phoenician prince Cadmus, and in Jason's quest for the golden teeth, and in Jason's quest for the golden... Sorry. I really want to see that, though. It'd be a less... Yeah. That's amazing. Slightly less dramatic story. The dragon's teeth feature prominently in the legends of the Phoenician prince Cadmus and in Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece. Cadmus, the bringer of literacy and civilization, killed the sacred dragon that guarded the spring of Ares. The goddess Athena told him to sow the teeth, from which sprang a group of ferocious warriors called the Spartoi. He threw a precious jewel into the midst of the warriors, who turned on each other in an attempt to seize the stone for themselves. The 5 survivors joined with Cadmus to found the city of Thebes. So they're a sort of a kind of origin myth for that city as well. But definitely a great title and a great episode. The following episode, we have One Small Step. Obviously, a reference to Neil Armstrong and really playing into this kind of nostalgia for NASA and the kind of sort of golden age of NASA, which weirdly is something that I feel like we're seeing again on TV at the moment, because we've got Disney have been streaming their adaptation of The Right Stuff. We've got Ron Moore's new series For All Mankind, which is, if anyone hasn't seen it, is absolutely phenomenal, I would say, which is this sort of alternate history of NASA through the 1970s and onwards. So it sort of feels like, for whatever reason, we're at a moment where we're kind of looking back to that period with a sort of real nostalgia, kind of early days of the space race and beyond. But this is absolutely Voyager, Star Trek's futuristic space exploration, looking back fondly to this kind of fictional, it's one of those things where it sits in between us and them, but it's told in this kind of very nostalgic way. I wonder if it's that they, at that point, this is the just about the turn of the millennium nearly, and they're starting to see that the actual space missions going into space are starting to be supplanted by, robots and these, more technical sort of missions into space. And there's not so many astronauts going out there and doing these things. So at that point, maybe they're looking back fondly on, like you say, that nostalgic sort of, exploration. And now I think with, this resurgence, you've also got that, it was recently cancelled after one season, but you had Away on Netflix, and you had the Challenger sort of docu-series as well that's been on there. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of forward thinking towards Mars. A lot of these sort of shows are thinking about the next steps, colonising future planets, the next steps of, actually getting a manned mission to Mars, which for all their complications that the previous American administration, as of recording, were talking about a manned mission to Mars. So, that's something that could well happen, one day. So, yeah, I think there's a real sort of... it is a really good title because it does evoke the moon landings, the moon mission. It's very interesting how Star Trek's and generally sort of television and storytelling is interested in this still. It seems to be coming back around, definitely. It's also, of course, the quotation that goes right back to, the time of the original series, going back to 1969, going back to the 1960s. The next episode I wanted to pull up, unless you've got anything in between, is Blink of an Eye, which is an episode that seems to go back, is literally almost identical to an episode of the original series, Wink of an Eye. But here we have Blink of an Eye, and a sort of slightly different take on, I suppose, basically the same idea that time is moving at different speeds for different people. Yeah, it is good. It's a well-known sort of phrase anyway, isn't it? Blink of an eye. And it kind of, again, it's quite evocative, but it can mean sort of different things. And it's certainly, there's obviously that whole idea of time dilation, and in this episode and that kind of thing. So it definitely evokes that. One thing I did want to briefly bring up in this little gap was the Voyager conspiracy, because I always felt that episode had huge promise and then never lived up to it at all, basically. But it was...
You wanted there to be a conspiracy, right?
I really
X-Files
style.
Just couldn't accept that the conspiracy was just 7 of 9 going slightly nuts.
Nuts. I was like, that's rubbish.
Conspiracy theorist, yeah.
I want there to be a syndicate of evil people on Voyager.
On Voyager,
But what I liked about it was that it sort of, that title almost felt a little bit leaning into that kind of 1970s conspiracy thriller, that the show, the episode maybe wants to sort of tap into, that something like, you get Robert Ludlum right in his novels, the Bourne conspiracy, the Bourne ultimate, that kind of thing. So I quite like the fact they did that. Even though it's a very simplistic title, there is a little bit of a wink towards that, kind of pulp sort of conspiratorial storytelling. So yeah, I did like that one.
Well, I'm going to jump forward quite a bit, but again, let me know if you have anything in the meantime. And just jump to the episode Collective, which is the episode where we get the Borg kids, just to make a sort of very small point that I wonder, what's the real collective here? Is it the Borg collective, or is it really about Voyager? Because this seems to be an episode that leans very much into this idea of Voyager as a family ship. They're literally sort of picking up waifs and strays and orphans along the way and folding them into their own collective. And it's an interesting, obviously it's a word that we associate with the Borg, but it's also it has a more benign feel than, assimilation, or later we're going to get, regeneration, which doesn't sound particularly sinister in its own right. But when you associate it with the Borg, it does. Whereas the idea of a collective, it just sort of struck me, it has a slightly double meaning here, maybe.
I think it does. And I think it's also one of those titles that only has resonance particularly to Star Trek fans if you understand the Borg. Particularly, you're coming into this, you see the word collective, you're going to go, oh, Borg collective if you're a Star Trek fan. Whereas if you're not that well versed in the Borg by this point, you won't necessarily understand the evocation beyond a very basic idea, of a collective. But I think it's interesting that we're at the point now where you can have these titles like collective, or later regeneration, which we'll get to, which play on your knowledge of the Borg, actually, in Star Trek lore. And I think that's not necessary. I don't know if that would have worked quite as well if you'd have done it in the Next Generation earlier on, when the Borg weren't quite as well known and well established, or arguably overused as they are in Voyager. You know what I mean?
Well, Lee made an interesting point, I think, in the previous episode of these, that often when these titles are the first thing that you know about the following week's episode, or or possibly even going a bit further ahead, if the titles sort of get out first, which certainly is the case now, and I think back in the day, sometimes you would get the titles kind of coming down the line. That there's an element of, often they are sort of teasing what kind of a story it's going to be. So he was saying with Deep Space Nine, you can kind of see, okay, that's going to be the Ferengi episode this season, that's going to be the Bajoran religion episode. Do you know what I mean? They kind of cue you into which of the various sandboxes that the show plays in, they're kind of going for that time. And I suppose obviously something like Collective, it cues you in, it's going to be a Borg episode. It doesn't really tell you anything other than that. But maybe that's enough, to kind of pique your interest. A couple of episodes down, I've got Ashes to Ashes. Now, I assume this is Dust to Dust rather than Fun to Funky, although it's a fairly funky episode, a bit of an odd one. This is the one where this woman mysteriously comes back, who they think has died, comes back to life as an alien, and claims she was always an alien or something, and the aliens try to... Well, no, maybe she doesn't claim she was always an alien. Maybe the aliens sort of say she's no longer the person that she was, and they've sort of reconfigured her into an alien or whatever. It's quite a strange one, but obviously, a reference to the kind of funeral, whatever you call it, the words of the kind of the funeral service, and this sense that for her, she's not turned to ashes. She hasn't turned to dust. She's kind of been reborn somehow.
Yeah, I think the race that sort of seemingly bring her back, the Kobali, they alter the DNA of dead individuals of other races to help them reproduce. So it's like an interesting, weird sort of combination of death and life. And I suppose the funereal title works in that sense. It's not very innovative, but it gives you a picture of what this is roughly going to be about, which is death, or rebirth and that kind of thing. So Yeah, it is a little bit odd. I don't know if it's really. Well, could they have come up with something slightly more off the wall, maybe? But, you know, it works, doesn't it, really?
Next up, after that, the next episode is Child's Play. Now, obviously, we're not here thinking of the psychopathic dolls.
Chucky.
But, yeah, exactly. But it's a weirdly... I suppose it's one of those titles that is kind of ironically innocent sounding, in that it evokes the idea of children. And actually, the episode is quite a dark one. This is the one where we discover that Icheb's parents have basically been trying to use him to damage the Borg in some way. He's been kind of used as a weapon. I suppose there's something there that he's the child and he's the kind of play. Do you know what I mean? They've got a play there, and he's being used as part of their play or their ploy or something, rather than, you know, the idea of something being child's play being incredibly easy. It doesn't seem that it's actually particularly easy. It's more that it's a sort of stratagem. Yeah.
Do you think also they always try and think of titles for episodes around sort of children characters that evoke childhood as well? I think of things, the one I always think of is Imaginary Friend in the next generation, which I always remember being quite haunting to me when I was a kid. There was just something about that episode that haunted me a little. So yeah, it's just, I think that's part of it as well. You're right in that probably the deeper meaning for this episode, but I think they also just try and give that immediate sort of recognition. Okay, this is going to be about kids. This is going to be about, you know, in this case, the Borg kids, you know, by the time we're in Voyager. So I think it's like an easy sort of shorthand for the audience.
It's weird though. It's, you know, this is not an episode about the younger children. This is about Icheb, who's kind of, well, I don't know how old he is. He's like late teens or something. Do you know what I mean? He's not really a child. He's not a child. I mean, he is the child in the story. He's the child of these people. But it's not really a story about children as such. It's more about, I suppose it's more about the parents, to be honest. After that, we have Good Shepherd. Now, Janeway explains in this episode, I think, the parable of the Good Shepherd. I don't think she mentions the Good Shepherd in the Bible is Jesus. So Janeway is basically Jesus in this episode, just as far as we can see. And in the parable, the Good Shepherd lays down their life for their sheep. Now, Janeway doesn't have to quite go that far in this episode. She seems to be taking it a bit more literally, as like the Good Shepherd kind of goes and takes care of their sheep and makes sure they've, you know, got enough grass to eat, and you know, they've got some shelter and all this sort of thing, and their needs are being met and they're happy. But it did just strike me if you think of Janeway as Jesus laying down her life for her sheep or whatever, Janeway is probably the most self-sacrificial Starfleet captain that we meet. I mean, all the Starfleet captains at some point have to do something incredibly brave and heroic and so on, but she is repeatedly quite willing to go down with the ship to kind of, you know, take do you know what I mean? To be the one who kind of sacrifices themselves, to the extent that sometimes it seems almost a little bit of not a character flaw exactly, but you sort of like wonder, why is she so quick to jump to do this, if you know what I mean? There's that episode, fairly early episode, where the Cardassian weapon ends up in the Delta Quadrant and is going to, you know, start attacking some planet.
Yeah.
And Janeway says, well, I'll stay on Voyager and, you know, crash it into this thing or something. Do you know what I mean? Like she seems more than willing to, you know, to put herself in that situation.
Maybe she's just sick of the life in the Delta Quadrant, you know, and she's like, I've had enough of this. Like, give me a reason to get out of here. But yeah,
an excuse. Right?
Yeah, I'm very unfamiliar generally, really, with this era of Voyager, the latter era of Voyager. But this is one I rewatched relatively recently as part of the run up to Lower Decks. And in this, there is a point where she's telling them, you know, get into the escape pods, you get out of there. And she's essentially willing to, you know, in theory, give her life up for these, you know, junior crewmen, you know, but then they refuse to go, you know, and that's all part of so there is some element of that, definitely, as you're saying, that she's, you know, that kamikaze aspect of Janeway, maybe, that she's just ready to, you know, throw. I suppose it's just her nobility, isn't it? You know, she is that very noble, self-sacrificial captain, and that is what makes her, you know, a really interesting character, I guess. Followed
up by the sort of antithesis of that, really, in the fake Janeway in the next episode, Live Fast and Prosper. Now, obviously, this is, you know, a sort of in reference to the idea of live long and prosper. But Live Fast is also, when I looked it up, I think a reference to Live Fast and Die Young which is a saying. And I think the title of a popular novel as well. Obviously, dying young being the opposite of living long, as the Vulcans encourage you to do. So I suppose these two mottos being sort of smashed together as a kind of emblem of this, the fraud at the heart of this storyline.
It's a weird title, though, I think. It really is mashing two things together that are very, very strange. So I've always looked at this title, I've always thought, does that even work? Live fast and prosper. It's not even like live, short and prosper, like instead of live long and prosper. Do you know what I mean? It's like a real... I'm not a big fan of that title.
I think it's like the idea of the con artist, isn't it? Who's going to live a fast life, kind of getting everything they want and kind of making the most of everything and prospering financially. I suppose that's the other thing, is sort of double meaning in terms of what do you mean by prosper? They're looking to prosper financially, rather than when Spock says it, we sort of imagine he means, almost spiritually, or, achieve what's important to you and do great works and so on, as opposed to, material prosperity. A couple of episodes down from that. Well, interesting. We have two episodes back to back, two very short titles, Muse and Fury. I don't have a huge amount to say about Muse, except that I think it's a lot better than the DS9 episode, The Muse. But they obviously didn't feel they really needed a new title. Fury, I think, is an interesting one because obviously Kes is very angry, but I also think there's maybe an idea there of the Furies, the Erinyes, who were these kind of avenging demons in Greek mythology. And I think Kes does sort of return, with her superpowers, and she's smashing the ship to pieces. She is on a kind of mission of vengeance, that in some ways does sort of, to me, slightly tie in with this kind of supernatural, rage-filled, avenging monsters almost somehow.
There is also a film called The Fury from Brian De Palma. Yeah, from 1978, starred Kirk Douglas, John Cassavetes, quite a decent cast actually, and it was based on a novel, and it was about CIA sort of psychic experiments and a young boy with a psychic power, and it's telekinesis and ESP and this kind of thing. I haven't seen it. I've heard it's very good.
You could be more on the money there, Tony, than me in that
so,
case.
Mate,
that is probably a stronger link then than the Greek mythology. But
could be a mix of both, though. Really, it could be a mix. I think it might, for some people, bring connotations of both of those things. Really.
Is this a Brannon Braga episode? Because if so, I feel like that's a far more likely reference.
He came up with the story with Rick Berman, apparently.
Okay, fine.
So,
right, there you go.
Could be.
Sort of sticking with that theme, a couple of episodes down, we got The Haunting of Deck 12. Now, this, I suppose, is a real sort of classic horror movie title. You've got The Haunting of Hill House. We've got The Haunting of Bly Manor, which I haven't seen, but everyone else seems to be watching at the moment on Netflix. It's sort of tying into a sort of real classic genre of the sort of haunted house, creepy story, which of course is exactly what the episode is about.
I really like it. It's nice to see a title like this. In fact, I watched House on Haunted Hill not so long back, the 1950s film with Vincent Price doing his, Vincent Price thing. But it's good. It's nice and evocative. I don't know if Trek very often sort of plays with the sort of gothic sort of Hammer or, classic sort of schlocky titles in this way. I know you've got things like Bride of Chaotica and that thing that are playing on stuff, but it's nice to see something that's a little bit more B-movie, I guess, in that way. Yeah, it's cool. I like it.
A couple of episodes down, we've got Imperfection, another one of these Borg episodes that I suppose tips its hand with the title. Interesting question. I suppose, there's I suppose an imperfection in Seven's, whatever it is, her implant or whatever. But is there kind of a sense that, Icheb being willing to do anything to save her, is that an imperfection? Is that it seems to me like it's a sort of perfectly, I was going to say human, he's not human, but do you know what I mean? It's a sort of perfectly kind of human thing to do somehow. Imperfection makes it sound like this is about a problem, and actually this seems like it being about something quite noble and, positive in a way, sort of. You're very, very Starfleet.
These Borg episodes are all about that, aren't they? They're always trying to unpick the human aspect of the Borg experience that sort of shows how cold and clinical and horrible being a Borg is. So yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, what you're saying, definitely.
A little bit further down the list, we've got critical care. Clara and I talked about this one back at the start of the previous lockdown. I think there's a little bit of a double meaning there insofar as, yes, it's about critical care, or what we would call intensive care in this country. But it's also an episode that is very critical of the care system in America. So I sort of wonder if there's a little hint of a kind of dig there in the title somehow. Like this is a critique in a sense, in a Star Trek episode.
A little bit of shade. I'd tell you what though, I'd say to anyone, if you haven't gone back and listened to your and Clara's conversation about that, it was fantastic. So it's really, you really unpick, all of the detail in this one. So yeah, you'll get all your interesting, stuff about this episode in that one.
This is followed by a sequence of episodes, which I think have some slightly puzzling titles in a way. We've got Inside Man, Body and Soul, and then, skipping one for a moment, Flesh and Blood. Now, first of all, Body and Soul and Flesh and Blood sound almost like they should be a two-parter.
Yeah.
Somehow, but they're not. Inside Man, this is one of those ones. I mean, like you, I'm not necessarily so familiar with this era of Voyager. I haven't watched a lot of these episodes for a good, 4 years now, since the 50th anniversary. I went back and watched the whole lot. I actually assumed Inside Man was the one where the Doctor is inside 7 of 9 and is which is actually the following episode, Body and Soul. Now, I think Inside Man would be a better title for that episode. Inside Man is actually the one where there's this kind of fake Barclay hologram and the Ferengi are using him on Voyager. But it's just a sort of weird sense that that episode could almost be, transferred to the following week's episode. And then so you've got Body and Soul, which is the one about the Doctor in 7. And this idea that the Doctor kind of, we get Jerry Ryan doing her kind of Robert Picardo impersonation. And then we get Flesh and Blood, which is the one about the hologram. Again, a sort of hologram story. This is the holograms that are being kind of used by the Hirogen, in the same way as in the Killing Game. We saw the crew being used by the Hirogen. Just a sort of strange, collection there, a little cluster there, where I think the episode titles feel like they're quite tied into each other somehow. Yeah,
and it's weird because they're not in terms of plot, really, I suppose. And they're, at the same time, though, they're fairly anodyne. They don't really give you a lot of... they don't really evoke a lot, to be fair. And it's a bit like, well... Again, could you have come up with... I think a far more interesting two-parter title for the Hirogen story is The Killing Game that we had a few seasons ago. That's much more interesting than Flesh and Blood. So what does that tell you, really? Everyone's flesh and blood, It's like, yeah, just a little bit... They're all a little bit dull, aren't they, to be honest?
Well, I guess if you're a hologram, you're not flesh and blood. So there's at least... that's sort of the...
Yeah, I suppose.
The contrast that's being drawn there. But yeah, I know what you mean. It doesn't really sell it.
No.
The other episode, just sort of in between those two, is Nightingale. Now, this is the episode where Harry Kim ends up in charge of a ship transporting vaccines, I think. So I sort of assume, although the ship is called the Nightingale, I think, which is why the episode is called that. But I assume there's kind of a Florence Nightingale reference there in that supposedly they're on this mission of medical mercy. Although I think, as I say, I haven't seen this one for a while. I have a feeling that it turns out to be otherwise.
I think he does name the ship after Florence Nightingale, yeah.
So, does he? Yeah, does he say that himself?
I think so,
okay,
yeah.
There you go.
So that fits. And it's, it's a nice title.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jumping down a little bit, we had the episode Lineage. I love this episode. I think it's a great episode, actually, of late Voyager. Great Torres episode. It is quite a grand title for what is basically, it's kind of Star Trek at its most soap opera, I think, this episode. Although it involves a bit of kind of sci-fi shenanigans and so on, it's really a very soapy story, going back to B'Elanna's childhood and where some of her issues have come from and so on. I think it's done brilliantly. I think it's done really well. It's a very moving episode, but calling it Lineage sort of makes it sound very formal somehow for what is ultimately such a personal episode. I think it's a strange choice in a way.
Yeah, it gets to the nub, I suppose, of what the episode's about. But yeah, again, could have created something far more evocative. Yeah, definitely.
couple of episodes down, another Torres episode, again about the baby Prophecy. This is one that feels very much like it could have been a DS9 title. I mean, we had in DS9 Destiny, now we've got Prophecy. And in some ways, it's quite a sort of DS9-y story, really. You know, is this child the subject of this, great religious significance or not? And yeah, exactly. And ultimately, does that all turn out to be a little bit kind of malleable to some extent? I quite like that episode that aspect of the episode where the Klingon is like, we can sort of massage this a little bit depending on what we need it to mean. But another good episode, I think. Jumping ahead, I think we're going to skip over Workforce, which I have very little to say about.
It's very dull.
The episode after that is Human Error. Now, this is a weird one. I think this is the episode where 7 of 9 makes her fake Chakotay on the holodeck to practice dating and so on. It's a very unromantic title, calling it Human Error, and also sounds very negative. I mean, I don't know. You kind of imagine Human Error would be about some kind of tragedy that occurred because someone ejected the wrong pod, or do you know what I mean? Like, there'd be sort of guilt and recrimination and drama and all that sort of thing. Whereas this is actually, okay, sort of bittersweet in the way that they often are, but is basically a kind of romance episode. So I find it a slightly odd choice. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, it feels actually quite like a Next Generation title, this Human Error. There's just something about that reminds me of that era. But yeah, it could
be a Data episode.
It could be a Data episode, yeah. And I think,
like in theory, or
right, exactly. And I think it's quite a clinical. That's the thing. A lot of these titles, they seem quite clinical when you have episodes that are, in theory, supposed to be quite emotional, and they're quite dry, clinical titles, and that's strange in a way. I don't know if they were just afraid to be a little bit more emotive, I think, with some of this.
I guess that's often, maybe that is the tendency as well. I mean, when we were looking at the early seasons of Voyager, it was all about the science titles, parallax and words like that, words that we have to go and look up in the kind of scientific dictionary. I know what you mean. There is a tendency for Star Trek episode titles to be a little bit detached, I suppose, somehow. Either they go in the kind of real flowery sort of original series DS9 titles that are kind of very kind of artsy and strange, or they're kind of very bold and descriptive, or they're kind of a little bit sort of terse, a little bit kind of cool, in that sort of sci-fi way, I suppose. Which I guess you could say in a way about the next one, Q2. I mean, this is the one with Q's son. There's 2 Qs. It's called Q2. It kind of does what it says on the tin. It doesn't really attempt, it certainly doesn't reach the heights of the Q and the Grey, which I said last time, I think is my favourite Q episode. Yeah. My favourite Q episode, my favourite title. But it's, it's perfectly, it's a Q episode. It kind of makes the point. You even know which Q episode it is, which is helpful, which is not always the case with, with some of them, Deja Q or, I don't know, Hiding Q or whatever. Yeah. You could be forgiven for mixing those ones up. At least this one, it kind of, it gives you enough of a clue to remember which Q episode you're dealing with.
You get the gist.
Followed by Author. This is a slightly controversial episode for various reasons. I think in terms of the title, it's quite a clever title, very much like Tinker Tenor, Doctor Spy. Here we have basically a Doctor joke with Author, where the word doctor is not in the title, but the comma and the repetition makes you think of a doctor. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's quite cleverly done in that way.
Yeah, it is good. It's there's something quite lyrical about it as well, which I like. I think it's again, it's quite playful. It's funny how they have these kind of titles for this character. Actually, it feels like they can be a bit more playful and whimsical. Actually, which is interesting. It doesn't feel like they can do that with a lot of the other characters.
That is an interesting point, yeah. I mean, obviously the Doctor, particularly towards the end of Voyager, we do get a lot of Doctor episodes. We're going to have another one in a minute. But you're right, there is a kind of they can have fun with him, I suppose. More so than maybe some of the other characters where, you know, if you think of, well, like I say, you know, B'Elanna Torres episodes, they seem to get quite kind of heavy, serious titles. And to be fair, they're serious episodes. They're not generally knockabout comedies, whereas the Doctor can sort of do both. The next one I had here was Homestead, just because I think it's an interesting choice of word, because it really brings us back to the Delta Quadrant as this sort of Wild West environment, which is kind of where we started at, you know, 7 years earlier. And obviously picking up with Neelix and the Talaxians and so on, there is a sense, although they're not literally going back, of kind of finding him a way of jumping ship. You know, we sort of assumed that past about season 3 or something, there's that episode where he says he's beyond the, you know, the known space of the Talaxians or whatever, that he's kind of left all that behind. Now he's sort of found a way of coming back to it, and they picked a word that sort of evokes very much that sort of feeling that we had, you know, even going back all the way to Caretaker, of Star Trek as the space western once again, and the Delta Quadrant in particular as this kind of wild, you know, Wild West environment. I think also though it sort of lays the track for the fact that home is coming, like, you know, that we're getting towards the end, and that's true.
You know, you found that with a lot, pretty much since season 6 through season 6, and especially season 7, they've been really laying the track for Endgame in many ways. You know, with all the Barclay and Deanna Troi episodes and all this kind of thing, there's been much more of a deliberate lean into Earth, to the Starfleet, to home than there ever was towards the beginning of Voyager. So maybe this is just really trying to sell the point that, you know, these characters are going home, and Neelix obviously is the first one who, you know, it does in a way. This is him going home in a way, even if he's, you know, miles away from where he started. Although it's interesting because a homestead is, I mean, obviously it is a home, but it's not. When they talk about going home, they talk about going back to where they came from. Do you know what I mean? Going back to Earth, going, you know, in the Wild West analogy, going back to Europe, I suppose, ultimately. Do you know what I mean? That's kind of, that's almost what's happening there. Whereas Neelix is being left, you know, he's left in the Delta Quadrant. You know, quite a surprising decision in many ways, I think, not to take him back to the Alpha Quadrant with them. And definitely sort of feels like, and I suppose there is that sense towards the end of Voyager that they are leaning back into some things from the early years, as much as they, you know, you're right in saying they look forward to the Alpha Quadrant and kind of laying the groundwork there. But they're also doing things like, you know, bringing back Joe Carey finally in order to kill him off. That's true. Someone sort of remembers that he's still alive. That's true. Just about. I don't know. There's this kind of weird sense of tying up loose threads, but some of which aren't really even loose threads by this point, but kind of wanting to tie in both directions. Full circle. A little bit to exactly bring things full circle. In a way, I suppose, that obviously Next Gen did with All Good Things. Voyager couldn't quite do that, but they, you know, with episodes like Shattered, for example, and you know, other episodes around that time, they're kind of looking for ways to create a sort of, maybe it's a sort of retroactive continuity in a way, to kind of create threads that are pulling all the way through the series from beginning to end. Yeah. After Homestead, we get Renaissance Man, which is another one of those Doctor episodes. Now, this one, again, should have been called Inside. I mean, if they were going to use the title Inside Man, I don't know. I do kind of feel they used it on the wrong episode. This one actually makes even more sense than Body and Soul. This is the one where the Doctor is impersonating everyone and is the kind of inside man on Voyager, basically. They couldn't use that one, so they called him Renaissance Man. Slightly odd. I suppose the Doctor is kind of a Renaissance man insofar as he's interested in opera and etc. But I don't know. I find it a slightly odd, especially an odd choice to use that term in a show where Leonardo da Vinci is actually a recurring character. You know, and yet this is a story about the Doctor being referred to in this way. I don't know. It seems a slightly odd title to me. I always wonder if it's a nod to the maybe lesser known film now, but the Danny DeVito comedy Renaissance Man from 1994. And he was like an advertising executive, and he's a bit of a huckster, and then he ends up teaching literacy to US Army cadets. It's not a complete, like, you know, parallel with the story in the episode Renaissance Man, but the both have a common thread about someone who's basically chancing their arm. I suppose he's trying to be a bit. I don't know. Maybe I just immediately. I always remember that being advertised on Sky Movies when I was a kid. I've never seen it, but I just always remember it being advertised. So I don't know.
I don't think I've ever seen it, but I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, that's interesting.
Could be a link to that.
Who knows? Who can say?
Yeah.
Okay, and then that is the penultimate episode of Voyager. Weirdly, so followed by Endgame. Not, I think, a reference to either the Avengers or the Samuel Beckett play, as far as I know, but I assume like both of those taken from chess, I think originally is where the term Endgame comes from. It's kind of the final moment, the final one. I can't think how to describe a chess match. It's the final bit of the chess match, basically, where the last decisions are being taken and someone discovers that they're royally screwed, basically, as the Borg Queen does in this instance. But it's interesting that it's a title, nowadays it's been so sort of eclipsed by the Avengers Endgame. I suppose that's the reference point that people think of. When this Voyager episode came out, I guess maybe it was the Beckett play, if it was anything. And I don't know to what extent that really plays into anything, but I suppose it's interesting that it's very different from, if you think of All Good Things, What You Leave Behind, they're quite kind of thoughtful. They're quite sort of, there's a sense of reflection, looking back on the past, a sense of loss in both of those. All Good Things come to an end, and What You Leave Behind, sort of sadness. Voyager doesn't go for that. Weirdly, for a show that is so nostalgic, it's kind of has nostalgia baked into it insofar as they're far from home and they want to get back to where they were before. It's not called Homecoming or something like that, which might be what you would expect.
Right.
It's called Endgame. It's leaning into the strategy. It's leaning into the kind of scheming. It's leaning into the...
Yeah, it's strange.
The strategic decision that the older Janeway is making. It's a weird way of framing this kind of final moment of the series, I think. And in some ways, I think it's a slightly odd finale because it's so much about this plot and so little about the kind of bigger story of the crew getting home. Hence, people always complaining, well, we don't get to see them on Earth. We don't get to see what that's like. Whereas DS9, the war wraps up about halfway through their finale, and then the rest of it is all kind of tying up loose ends and sending people on their way and so on. I don't know. It's a slightly odd choice for how to end the series, I think, and it's a slightly odd choice for what to call it as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's quite a ubiquitous title, though. I mean, Endgame has been used. I mean, when that first came on, I immediately thought there's an X-Files episode called Endgame, which was in its second season. There won't be any link there, really, but it's just a title that has been used as an episode of Alias called Endgame, and they're not necessarily like, episodes at the end of seasons. They just happen to be part, and often they do lean into something that's either a conclusive aspect or part of a strategy. And it feels like, well, I think it's telling that Kirsten Byers' sequel sort of non-canonical Voyager novel, the first one was called Homecoming, and I think that I don't
think that was Kirsten Beyer. I think that was Christine Golden.
You're right. Right.
I think she did a couple.
Yes.
Kirsten Beyer, though, interestingly, hers are called Full Circle, aren't they? I think is that what the first one's called?
Yeah,
it's Full Circle, which again sort of links to this idea of tying bringing it all together, kind of All Good Things, kind of bringing it all together.
That would have worked.
I don't know.
Full Circle would have been a good title as well. Yeah, you are right there. It was Christy Golden. You're absolutely right. And it's, I think Full Circle, Homecoming, they would have been far more fitting titles for a film, a story that's all about them going back to where they'd come from. I think maybe they wanted something called it in terms of Endgame with drama impact. Maybe they thought that was, an exciting title. Endgame, it's the suggestion of something huge. And that was the case before Avengers used Endgame. Although, ironically, I think Avengers Endgame is quite a boring title for that film. I thought Infinity War was a far more interesting title, and I would have preferred them to have Infinity War Part 2, quite honestly, which was, I think, the original idea, that it was going to be 2. I think that's far more interesting than Endgame. It's always struck me as a fairly sort of monolithic bush, there it is title. There's not much nuance to it, So no, I agree. I think they could have been, as has been the case through all of these Voyager episodes we've talked about today, they could have been more inventive, frankly.
it's kind of telling you in no uncertain terms this is the last episode, isn't it? Which I think is the case, with the Avengers as well. I mean, I know obviously there are more Avengers movies, and that's just the end of that sort of sequence. But at the same time, it is an ending. It is definitely a kind of finale of sorts. Yeah. It just strikes me, looking again on Wikipedia, the endgame is the stage of the game when few pieces are left on the board. In particular, pawns become more important as endgames often revolve around attempting to promote a pawn by advancing it to the 8th rank. I suppose that fits with the mood of the Avengers endgame, I think, because there's this sense, well, you get that bit at the end, don't you, where it's just Captain America all on his own, and then the kind of reinforcements come in that kind of iconic moment. But I suppose that sense of it being, and maybe in the Voyager, I guess it's just Janeway and the Borg Queen by the end of it, isn't it? And two queens essentially. There is a kind of chess metaphor going on there. The two queens kind of squaring off against each other,
perhaps. Yeah,
but anyway, that brings us to an end of Voyager, and straight on, I guess, without the year's break that Brannon Braga wanted to have a bit of a rest and get his head around what was happening next, we go straight into Enterprise with Broken Bow. This, I think, is a very strange title for a series premiere. I mean, we had, Encounter at Farpoint, sounds quite sort of mysterious. Farpoint sort of kind of out there. We had Emissary, which, led into this whole big thing with these god characters. Caretaker, I suppose, sounds quite mundane, but once we realise that it's this god that can fling you around the universe, sounds quite grand. Broken Bow it's very Earthbound for a start, which I suppose makes sense because this is the show that, Braga famously wanted to spend a whole season on Earth before they even left, which I think would have been very interesting. But so it's not named after, going off after the Suliban and going off or taking the Klingon to Kronos or, any of this kind of sci-fi stuff. It's named after this place in Oklahoma. It's also got a weird kind of idea. I think if you think of a broken bow, I think the broken bow in America is named for a Native American's bow that was discovered somewhere when a particular place was founded or whatever, but I find it can't help making you think of a bow is meant to fire something into the air, and this one is broken, so it can't do that. And that is kind of the story that we're being given with the humans and the Vulcans, that the humans are ready to fly and the Vulcans have broken their bow. Do you know what I mean? The Vulcans are holding them back. They're kind of stopping them from soaring off into the sky. So I don't know whether that's a sort of deliberate echo there, but it's quite a sort of downbeat sounding title, if you know what I mean. It doesn't sound heroic or grand or exciting or, adventurous at all. It sounds quite kind of depressing, really. Something that's broken, something that doesn't work.
Yeah. And like you say, it's very American Earthbound kind of title. I mean, I quite like it, actually. I mean, to be fair, I think this, maybe it's been eclipsed by the Vulcan Hello, which I think is very good. But this, for a long time, has been my favourite Star Trek pilot, actually. Because I think it's a cracking episode. I don't think the rest of the season really lives up to it for the most part, but I think it's a really good opening episode, a couple of episodes. So I quite like the title, but I think there's a good metaphor for it there in terms of the humans and the Vulcans. But I know what you mean. It is a little bit downbeat. It doesn't have the thrust of or the power of something like Emissary, the mysticism, which fits very well with DS9. Caretaker, I always found was a bit dull. I never really, I mean, obviously it references a thing in the story, but again, I think you could have had something far more interesting, and mysterious for Voyager's pilot episode title. So I think in that, Encounter at Farpoint's good, even though the episode's shonky, the title of that is good. So I think Broken Bow, it's not maybe as good a title as the episode itself, actually, which is rare.
Maybe the pilots, the quality of the episodes is sort of inversely proportional to the quality of the titles.
Could be. Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. Anyway, that's followed up by Fight or Flight. I think this is the episode where Hoshi is terrified of everything. So I guess, the fight or flight. It's sort of a double mean, flight as in space flight, but it's also fight or flight is what you do when you're terrified. So it's that's quite a nice little pun there. Then we get Strange New World. Now, this is the first of these kind of Star Trek, I don't know what you'd call them, referencing Star Trek's own vernacular in a way, or Star Trek's own language. couple of episodes down, we're going to have Civilization, which obviously is a reference to the new lives and new civilizations, or new life and new civilizations. Strange New World obviously is also about to be, or Strange New Worlds is also about to be the name of the Pike show. So it's one that's even kind of, being picked up on again. But it's interesting that Enterprise, in being this prequel, one of the ways that it kind of signals its prequelness is by tapping into this kind of language of Star Trek, going right back to the 1960s and naming its episodes after these kind of phrases that are so familiar by now, even though until the final episode, we're never going to actually hear them spoken in Enterprise.
No. But that, again, it's sort of similar to what I said about the collective in Voyager. It's playing on audience recognition at this point. It's been around that long. Enterprise is a show that's got one eye very much on the original series. There's an argument that all of the Star Trek sequels want to be that first show in many ways. They're always trying to find some alchemy that gets them to it in a way. And Enterprise is particularly in that vein. It really, really, in its own way, wants to be a bit of the 60s show. So, but I think it's great to use this. I mean, I quite like this episode. I think some of these early episodes of Enterprise are trying to sort of really pull everything back and give us that sense of mystery and uncertainty to this universe, that we've never really seen before. So I think using this, it's a nice title. There's a level of enigma and sweep to a title like this. So yeah, I'm glad they used it. And like you say, it makes, I think that naming a Pike Enterprise show Strange New Worlds is excellent. I think that's a great choice for a title of a show. So yeah, it's really good.
Well, interesting. You should talk about the unknown and so on, because the next episode is Unexpected, but not really. I think. I mean, this is a pretty cheap pun, I guess, insofar as we say someone's expecting when they are having a baby. This is an unexpected expectation, if you know what I mean. Insofar as Trip certainly wasn't expecting it. I don't know. Not a great episode, but perfectly serviceable pun for a title, I think.
Yeah, it's a bit cheeky, isn't it? But you get the point.
The next one I wanted to pull up was the Andorian Incident. This is very much an original series sounding episode. I mean, we had the Enterprise Incident, obviously, and we've had various other incidents and, whatever, there's something dilemma and this, equation and I don't know, it's that kind of classic sort of sci-fi formula. But here it's the Andorian Incident. Great episode, great title as well. Followed by Breaking the Ice. This is a bit of a creaky pun, in my opinion. I mean, we've got the Vulcans, are we sort of breaking the ice with the Vulcans and this sort of thawing of relations to some extent, or are they? And then we've got, they're literally on a comet that's covered in ice. The ice is breaking up and so on. I don't know. It's like, to me, it's that goes. I mean, the thing about puns, I like a good pun, but I suppose that if they get too cringy, then, I switch off, which is slightly how I think I was feeling about Enterprise in first run by this point. Was the kind of the puns weren't helping necessarily. No. Or certainly this one wasn't.
No, it's a bit on the nose, isn't it? I think it's that whole thing of Enterprise. It's that the problem with it is that it very quickly starts to become a little bit of, if not quite self-parody, then it starts to become a little bit of a shadow of better things. And I think, a title like this, I don't think it would have got past. I mean, it might. I think it's too cheeky to have been a Voyager title because, like we said, they were quite clinical. But I don't think you would have got this into DS9. They were far more inventive, for instance, with their titles. So yeah, it's a bit it's a bit honky and a bit okay. You can get away with Unexpected because it's almost like a little cheeky twist. But yeah, this is a little bit much.
A little bit much, even for us.
Yeah.
Then we have Civilization, which I mentioned earlier, followed by Fortunate Son. Now, I thought this was strange just because there's a Voyager episode called Favourite Son, and I've always got these two mixed up in my head and can't remember which is which. This is the one, the ship is called the Fortunate, and it's about Travis, I think, so he's the son. Favourite Son, I only realised when I was looking up this episode, I sort of glided over it when we were doing Voyager episodes, but Favourite Son is a reference to a term in American politics, which I think is what Harry in that Voyager episode is sort of, is because he's being claimed by this alien species, and the idea of a favourite son is, I think, a politician who's sort of back in their own, where they grew up, which, we heard recently in the, election coverage, about Biden going back to, I can't even remember what state he grew up in or whatever, but the kind of significance of the kind of coming home and so on.
I also always think of, and there may be no connection, but I always think of the song by Creedence Clearwater Revival called Fortunate Son, which was from 1969. I love one of my favourite bands. And it was very much an anti-war anthem. So it was all about, counterculture and the US involvement in Vietnam War. It's a pretty famous song for that ilk, really. And I don't know necessarily if there's a big connection here, but I don't know if they had that in the back of their minds as well as everything you were saying. Possibly. It's a great song, either way.
That makes a lot of sense, since that I'm not familiar with that song and I completely missed that. My apologies. Yeah. Okay. And also, I don't know whether I'm thinking, when I say it's about the sun, maybe I'm thinking of the other episode where Travis goes to his parents' ship, which is actually called something else, Horizon or something, isn't it? I think.
Oh, yeah. Season 2,
What is this one? I'm mixing up two. There is a link between them, I think. It's another one of these like early Earth ships, but this is the Fortunate.
The Fortunate, yeah. This is where there are Nausicans.
By Nausicans.
Yeah.
And who's the sun then? I don't know. I have to say, I don't think I remember this episode well enough to say with any certainty whether there's a sun in it. But someone will have watched it more recently than we have. But yeah, absolutely. I think the song must be the reference point here. Although Memory Alpha does not. You could go and add that helpfully to the Memory Alpha page, maybe, because it's not.
Maybe
not coming up trumps this time. The next episode after that is Cold Front. Now, this is one of the Temporal Cold War episodes, I think, and there's quite a few of them that have a front. There's like Storm Front. Are there other fronts? I can't remember. I have to say, I get all the Temporal Cold War episodes mixed up in my head with the titles, but this is certainly one of them. Obviously, I suppose a reference to the weather originally, but yeah, I quite like that it has the word cold in there, since we're dealing with a Cold War. I think it's this one works quite well for me.
I think that's what they're going for, aren't they? Definitely, they're going for this idea of introducing the Temporal Cold War. Cold Front has that. There's you could imagine that being a spy novel name. You could imagine that being a Cold War spy thriller, story. So I think, yeah, I like it. I mean, like you say, they're all a little bit. They all sort of combine together in my head, a lot of these, until you get to, well, actually, even in season 3, the only one that really stands out to me is like the Expanse, for obvious reasons. But like, so many of them just blend in my head. Maybe Shockwave as well. But yeah, it's a good one. It is a good one.
Interesting you should mention the Cold War like spy thriller, because the next episode is Silent Enemy.
Yeah.
Which to me makes me think of that kind of era. Although actually, I discovered it's a 1958 World War II movie about Italians mining British ships. And then I started thinking, is this the one about the Romulan minefield? But it isn't. Again, this is kind of showing how I probably need to go and do an Enterprise rewatch. This is the one about the strange aliens who attack and then disappear, and they never really get to find out who they are. And it's quite mysterious and sort of strange in a way. Silent Enemy is definitely a great title, I think. It is. Whatever you think of the episode. And definitely it does feel like it's sort of tapping into that kind of... I suppose it is tapping into that kind of wartime... mode, if you know what I mean, one way or another.
Definitely, yeah. It has you. I think of submarines. I think of that, deep run, silent running kind of thing. So it's
yeah.
They're definitely wanting to give you that vibe of the Enterprise in this unknown, ocean-like vast space territory where these mysterious other alien ships are there trying to attack. It's good. I think it's quite evocative. Definitely, yeah. It's a good one.
Couple of episodes down, we've got Sleeping Dogs. Obviously, Sleeping Dogs, you're supposed to let them lie. This is the episode where there's a Klingon who I think they do not let lie. They wake them up, maybe, and then the Klingon causes trouble.
Yeah,
I suppose that's the illusion there. Whether the Klingons would be happy being referred to as dogs, I don't know. We've had the Dogs of War, obviously. You know, General Chang was quite happy releasing the Dogs of War. Maybe there's a kind of a parallel there. But I guess just that idea of a sort of a threat that can be awakened in a way that you'd expect this to be about some hugely powerful, monstrous. Do you know what I mean? Like a bit like the waking up the Vardwa, the kind of dragon's teeth. This is almost it almost kind of conjures that sort of idea somehow. Sleeping dogs.
I think in a way though it fits as a Klingon title. Like there's something aggressive about it. There's something sharp about it, and I feel like I don't know. I know that Klingons aren't traditionally called dogs, but there is a certain viciousness about them as a race, severity. So I think something like Sleeping Dogs, it's actually quite a good Klingon title for me. So yeah.
Jumping down a little bit, we have the episode Fusion. Now, this is very much kind of Voyager-style title in that it's a word taken out of science. It's an interesting one because this is an episode that is about something quite personal and quite, it's kind of basically a sort of sexual assault allegory, really, that's going on here. But they've gone for this very kind of clinical title. I suppose, mind melt is a fusion of minds, a fusion of two people. But maybe the word fusion as well, because we think of, like nuclear fusion and so on. It does suggest this idea of both great power, but also danger somehow. There's something kind of, slightly threatening about it, which kind of fits well with this episode in a way.
I think it's that, again, if Sleeping Dogs has a very Klingon aspect, Fusion definitely evokes Vulcan. It invokes that sense of warring emotion, that battle within in many ways. I think the battle of the mind as well. I think it's good. I like it in terms of a, particularly Vulcan, leaning episode. And involving that, emotional battle. It's weird because it should be bland, but there's something interesting about it. Actually, more than some of those other Voyager episodes we talked about.
Unlike the next one I have, which is Acquisition. Now, I don't really think this episode tells us anything except that we're doing the Ferengi, bizarrely, on Enterprise. And I don't think the episode itself offers anything other than we're doing the Ferengi bizarrely on Enterprise. It's sort of totally disposable, kind of pointless episode. But the title does tell you we're doing a Ferengi episode. But
that's it. That's exactly the thing. It's a title for Star Trek fans, and that's it. The only people who are going to know what that means are Star Trek fans. It's for nobody else, which I suppose is the point. I guess that they're at this point now where they're like, okay, well, we're giving them what they want. But at the same time, the whole point of Enterprise, but it wasn't supposed to be doing this stuff anymore. It wasn't supposed to be doing nods to DS9 or Next Generation. It was supposed to be charting its own course. So for within the first season to be doing a Ferengi episode that brings back all of the actors almost who played Ferengi in the past is just like, oh, come on guys, you can be more inventive than this.
It's the ultimate lazy episode, and it's the ultimate lazy title, I suppose, is the thing. Followed by an episode which basically just rips off a DS9 episode, Oasis. This is the one where they redo Shadowplay, and apparently while they were filming it, René Aubergenois commented to Scott Bakula, I think, we did this episode a few years ago, and he was a bit surprised. I'm not sure why it's called Oasis, unless is there a ship? Is it a crash ship? I can't remember. Maybe that's called the Oasis. It seems to me it's more like a mirage that's being invoked, maybe with these kind of like, imaginary people. Are they real? Are they not? I mean, an oasis is actually a real thing, but obviously I think when you think of an oasis in the desert, it is often a mirage. It's not real. It's a fake oasis, I suppose. Maybe that's what they're getting at here.
Yeah.
Not a particularly interesting episode.
I can't remember it at all.
One that we could have brought it up years ago when we did our Shakespeare episode, because I think it is a kind of another one of the slightly Tempest inflected episodes, in that it's about the kind of old guy and his daughter, stranded somewhere. But odd title. I can't help thinking as well of the rather disgusting drinks that we have here. I don't know if they have them in the States, but Oasis is like a sort of a fruity drink, but and always are they sugar free? Is there something? Is that the idea? Because they have some really weird taste that I think is to try and make them whatever their sweetener is that they use. They always make me feel sick.
They're health free. I think they're just devoid of anything good.
Yeah, they're awful. Sort of pink, weird pink water, basically. Next up, slightly more interesting one, I think, Detained. Now, this was the episode that I think at the time they said they were inspired more by the Japanese internment camps of World War II. But coming as it did, Enterprise debuted around the same time as 9/11, and obviously, the War on Terror and so on. You can't help seeing this episode as a kind of Guantanamo Bay allegory, really. Whether that was the original intention or not, I think that's definitely how it plays. And obviously, that was where we kind of got this language of detention and detainees. They weren't prisoners of war, they were detainees. And I think the title at least does seem to deliberately allude to that.
Yeah, definitely. You could have called this something like rendition. It's got that same sort of vibe to it. Absolutely. Yeah. It has to be leaning into that. Enterprise is very much a show that lives in the shadow of 9/11 and the War on Terror and things like this. So yeah, absolutely. It's sort of their first flirtation, I think, with these kind of themes that are going to become more powerful later on in the show's run, I think.
Followed by a nice, obscure Latin title, Vox Sola, which means lone voice. I mean, Lee and I were talking last time about how Ron Moore was getting ribbed by the Voyager writers for Inter Arma Enim Silent Leges.
Oh, yeah.
Which they just couldn't wrap their heads around. I get the Vox Sola, again, obviously less wordy, but... unless you are, pretty familiar with Latin, you're probably going to be slightly puzzled by it. But it's this episode where Hoshi is trying to communicate with this kind of weird entity that sort of absorbs people and has this kind of group consciousness and so on. So it makes sense as a title. I think it's quite a good title. It feels quite alien. It feels quite strange, and slightly sinister somehow. And yet maybe appropriately, for the average viewer, we don't really know what it means, and we have to go and look it up, which I guess is kind of the point of what's happening in the episode, a kind of challenge, a communication challenge. So maybe it makes sense that it's in another language.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, give me titles like this any day over, Lineage and, really dull ones like that. I'd rather have something like this. It's a bit more intriguing.
Well, what do you think of 2 Days and 2 Nights? This is the kind of Rysian romp. I can't help thinking of the Harrison Ford movie, 6 Days, 7 Nights.
Definitely.
Where they crash a plane on a kind of desert island somewhere. I don't know if that's deliberate. I don't know whether that is itself a reference to... I couldn't work out a way of Googling this. Is this idea of however many days and however many nights? Obviously, it's something that we think of when booking holidays. It's, it's a way that holidays are advertised. But is there a film prior to that one that one is riffing on? Is there a book? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Is there a reference point going further back than that slightly ropey Harrison Ford movie or not? I'm not sure. But anyway, that's what it made me think of.
Yeah, absolutely. Same. And I think to me, it feels like it's trying to evoke a sense of romance and maybe slightly more classical adventure in a way than and obviously in this it's lovely. They go into Risa and it's much more of that kind of episode, a bit like the DS9 one, Let He Who Is Without Sin, that kind of, or Captain's Holiday, those kind of episodes. And so I think they're going for that, not whimsy, but that certain sense of let your hair down kind of title, really, compared to some of these others.
According to Memory Alpha, Chris Black, who I think wrote this one, said we wanted to have Archer involved in a little intrigue to put him in an almost Cary Grant-like role from a Hitchcock movie.
Yeah.
He meets Grace Kelly in the villa next door and she's very mysterious. So that absolutely sort of ties in with that slightly, I suppose it's a little bit kind of old-fashioned, a little bit kind of classic. The sort of, I mean, I guess we had it as well, with Captain's Holiday, Picard on Risa and his sort of, I don't know, flirty adventure that he gets there. But I think it's a serviceable title, at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, if any listeners are familiar with another reference point for however many days and however many nights that we haven't heard of and that Google can't generate for me, let me know.
Let us know.
I'm interested to hear that. Carbon Creek is an interesting one, I think, just because it's another one of these episodes that's named after a place on Earth. We had Broken Bow. Now we've got Carbon Creek. We're going to have Carpenter Street. These quite sort of grounded, I mean, they're literally grounded episodes and they take place on Earth, but they're all named after the place that they take place. Well, Broken Bow isn't a grounded episode, but they evoke that groundedness to some extent.
Definitely.
In a way that I don't think we get, that I can think of elsewhere in Star Trek. I mean, even, when Voyager did an episode on Earth, it was called 1159. It was about the moment rather than the place. I can't think of any other episodes that are about, that are titled so sort of specifically as that. So I think it's an interesting choice anyway. After that, we have Minefield, which I mentioned earlier, which is a pretty descriptive title. Then we have Dead Stop, which I think is a great sort of dark pun, because obviously they're at a dead stop. They can't go any further, but it's also quite sinister. This is a dead stop that may end up killing you. So I quite like that one.
Yeah, it's quite
kind of dark, slightly horror style episode in a way. It's quite nice, especially since it's an episode that doesn't start off like that. It starts off seeming quite innocent and nice, and then it gradually gets more and more sinister. I think it's nice that the title also has that in there as well.
It could be a horror title. You're right, actually. It could be a zombie movie, something like that.
It could be a zombie movie. It could be, one of those, like your car breaks down on the road.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? One of those
breakdown. Yeah.
You can imagine exactly like the young girl,
the hitcher, those kind of things.
Exactly, it's sort of hitchhiking. Yeah, exactly. All that, backwoodsy kind of sort of redneck horror kind of that.
Yeah.
Then that's followed by A Night in Sickbay. I'm not sure if this is a reference to anything really. I suppose it has a sort of quite nice kind of cozy feel to it. A little bit like you were saying with 2 Days and 2 Nights. And it is a sort of gentle episode, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, I think Rick Berman said that he wanted to evoke the odd couple between Archer and Phlox in this.
Right, okay.
The classics of Walter Matthau, Jack Lemmon, what film and then TV show by Neil Simon, and it's I don't know. I quite like the title because it's one of the. I tell you, you know what it reminds. If anything, it reminds me more of a Babylon 5 title. It's the kind of title that you could imagine being, designed as it's a character piece that's designed to be a little bit more of a internal, story, but yet one that's just a little bit more playful, again, in many ways, and not necessarily as blunt or clinical as some of the Star Trek titles. So yeah, it's not necessarily a big reference point for anything specific, but I quite like the internal nature of it. A Night in Sickbay. It's very much about people, and about just the ship itself. That's quite nice. It's quite a change in pace.
Definitely. It's kind of a change in pace and a change in pace for the title as well. A couple of episodes down, we've got The Seventh. Now, this is a very strange one, I think, because it sounds like an incomplete title. Maybe that's deliberate. I mean, this is sort of about incomplete memories, isn't it? Or things that have kind of been, but you think, is it, the Seventh Seal or the Seventh, I don't know, the Seventh
configuration.
It's very odd to call it The Seventh, I think. Yeah, exactly. I don't know. It's a strange one. I suppose it stands out partly by virtue of being quite strange. It's a sort of awkward title because it doesn't, I guess because it sort of feels like it's missing a noun. And the seventh obviously is the noun, but you imagine there's a word missing somehow.
And I wonder if there's a weird, like, meta aspect because it's the 7th episode of the season as well. So
is it?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Like, but they wouldn't surely have named it just as like
it's like a working
episode.
Title,
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, that's an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, is that a coincidence? Is it a coincidence?
Is it a coincidence? I don't know. Well, yeah,
I don't know.
Okay. A few episodes down, we've got Vanishing Point. This is a pretty terrible episode, I think. But
great title, though.
Quite a good title, I think. Yeah, good sciencey title because it's one of those sciencey titles. It does feel like it could be a Voyager title or whatever. But in the context of the episode, it has that kind of slight sinister edge to it somehow. In this kind of existential crisis that's kind of going on there. I think it's not a bad one.
There is also a film from 1971 called Vanishing Point.
Is there? Okay.
As well? Yeah. Which about a disaffected ex-policeman and race driver who deliver a souped-up car cross-country while high on speed. So I don't know if it's really going to be linked to this.
That sounds more fun than the Enterprise episode, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah, maybe.
Followed by Precious Cargo, not a particularly precious, not a gem in the pantheon of Star Trek episodes. I suppose you could say the character in it is pretty precious herself, insofar as she's, has a lot of a high regard for herself and so on. But terrible episode, not a particularly inspiring title either, I don't think, really. Although I guess it's kind of ironic in both for within the episode and of the episode itself. Then we have Star Trek Nemesis. Now, you and I mentioned when we were talking about the Picard series, season 1, this interesting choice of Michael Chabon to use the word hubris in that famous line, which I won't quote now because I'll get us in trouble. Nemesis was the Greek goddess, I think, the goddess of revenge, who punished those guilty of hubris. Hubris being sort of too much regard for yourself and a lack of sort of respect to the gods, I think, basically. So interesting that's the kind of origin of that word. Now, obviously, we think of as a nemesis as just a kind of implacable enemy. We think of Khan as Kirk's nemesis. Although, again, there's this kind of element of revenge, a sort of remorseless foe. And I suppose, they were very consciously with Star Trek Nemesis trying to give Picard a Khan, and they couldn't find one by going back into the Next Gen back catalogue. So they sort of had to invent one with this, weird backstory for Shinzon. But there is very much a kind of element of revenge there. There is a kind of element of, he is almost a bit like a sort of force of nature somehow, Shinzon. So I suppose there is a kind of, I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of this film, but I think it's a good title. It's, it kind of sells what they're going for, at least, whether they pull it off or not.
Yeah, I don't mind Nemesis. I find it's okay. It's not as bad as I think some people say. I still think it's probably the weakest Next Generation film, but it does the job. The title does the job. I think it's a sign that they really wanted to show it's obviously they want to go dark with this film, obviously, as was the trend at the time. Let's go dark, let's go big. And it works in that sense. The problem with the title like this is that to have Nemesis, you've really got to have a hell of a character, I think, to really sell that. And I don't know if Shinzon was, in many ways. Nemesis would feel like, you could have called Star Trek 2 Nemesis in a way, because I would have bought Khan more as a nemesis for Kirk in some senses, given their history.
You're right. It's kind of overselling the villain somehow.
A little, yeah.
And, nothing against Tom Hardy, who obviously is a fantastic actor, but
no,
I'm not. And, I think he's pretty good in that film, but he is so young and he's so, I don't know. I mean, he's not necessarily the problem with that film, but
No, not at all.
I do slightly wonder. At one point, they had this idea that Patrick Stewart was going to play the villain as well. I can't help thinking that would have been, or, in a different story, if they'd got Ian McKellen in as the, do you know what I mean? You'd buy that as a nemesis. Do you know, someone who's equal.
Sure.
I think that's part of the problem. I never really bought that Tom Hardy was an equal opposite to Picard in the way that Khan is sort of an equal opposite to Kirk. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Absolutely.
There's no mutual, there isn't the kind of mutual respect. There isn't the kind of, because as much as, okay, we can be told that Shinzon has achieved all this stuff and, done a kind of coup on the Romulans and accumulated all this power and so on. All we really see is this random, creepy guy, with his weird sort of personal issues. It doesn't, I don't know. We don't really, they don't sell that somehow. They don't sell him as this sort of great, brilliant tactical genius or whatever he's supposed to be somehow.
Absolutely.
It just seems like this kind of boy who's got serious psychological issues,
for me, a nemesis is like Cisco and Ducat. That's a nemesis.
Exactly.
Yeah. You've a relationship you've built up over years that it builds this incredibly epic, battle at the end. So it doesn't really work. But
and there does have to be a kind of mutual respect, which I think on one level, Ducati is always trying to get Cisco's respect, and on one level, I mean, I don't think Cisco respects him much as a person, but you have to respect Ducat as a kind of, I don't know, he is a sort of force, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he's kind of, do you know what I mean? You don't turn your back on him. You don't underestimate him. You kind of, you respect his ability, if you know what I mean, to a certain extent.
Sure.
Yeah, you're right. He's maybe more of a nemesis than Shinzon is. So coming back to Enterprise, we've got the episode Future Tense. I guess this sells time travel shenanigans. This is another one of these slightly interchangeable ones for me. I have to say, sadly, not a sequel to Past Tense, and probably not up there with that one.
This is where they all blend. Cold Front, Future Tense, but it is quite good. It is quite interesting. It's a play on what we know before. The phrase past tense. I quite like. There is an element of invention with these Cold War titles, these temporal Cold War titles. They're at least trying to play with language, play with our expectations of either Cold War titles or, ideas about time, and things like that. That's quite clever. That's quite good in a way.
Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to the Borg episode that we mentioned before, Regeneration. Yeah. Now, again, I think this is just kind of doing for the Borg what Acquisition was doing for the Ferengi. I suppose there is an element of these, we thought the Borg were asleep. They've regenerated. Do you know what I mean? We've woken them up. We've kind of dug them up. They live, these kind of zombie Borg from the Arctic or wherever they are. So there's that. But otherwise, it does feel a little bit like it's kind of just signalling, this is our Borg one.
Yeah, it's a shame in a way, because I think this is a fantastic episode, generally, of any Star Trek. I think it's a really great way to utilise... this isn't Acquisition, where it's just hackneyed and ridiculous. This is a really clever way to bring the Borg in without bringing the Borg in. And it's really clever. And the fact it all becomes a predestination paradox as well. Fantastic. I love all that. But why did they have to give it a Voyager title? You could have gone with something far more interesting to this. And I get why, because it's that immediate understanding of this is a Borg episode. And I remember when, like you say, the titles were coming out before the episodes half the time back in the day. And I remember seeing Regeneration. I was like, oh, it's Borg. The Borg. I did get that happen, admittedly. So on that level, it's good. But when in advance, it was great. But when you get there, it's like, fine, I get the point. But it's still a little bit Trek of old. It's still that whole sort of recognition factor that they're not pushing into new territory, or trying new things. You look at the titles we've got now in the new Trek era. They're far more inventive by and large, most of them. They're really interesting what they're trying to do. So, yeah, it's a blandish title, but yet for one of Enterprise's best episodes,
Followed by First Flight. Now, this is, I mentioned the right stuff earlier. This is really Enterprise leaning into that kind of right stuff.
Yeah.
Nostalgia. First Flight's an interesting title, though. I mean, to me, that kind of suggests more like the Wright brothers rather than the right stuff, if you know what I mean. But definitely that's kind of what they're going for there. And this idea of flight, as I was saying, if Broken Bow suggests a flight that doesn't, get to happen, I suppose this is one that does take off.
Could they have called the pilot this? Would this have been a better title?
Absolutely,
for the pilot?
yeah.
I think it would have been,
so. I think it would. I would have gone for that. Yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
Definitely.
But, it's not to be. Then I was going to jump along to one you mentioned, The Expanse. Now, I find this quite an odd title because what I remember about the season 2 episode is this attack. It's this kind of terrible loss of life. It's this awful tragedy. It's this sense of... this kind of 9/11 moment, basically. To call it The Expanse is quite strange. I don't know why they didn't save that for the first episode of the next season.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they're already in The Expanse by then. They do sort of get into The Expanse, I think, towards the end of this episode. But most of the episode is dealing with this kind of atrocity that's happened and deciding what to do and planning to go into The Expanse. I don't know. It's an odd... kind of an odd one. Obviously now we have, I don't know if you watch The Expanse, the TV show The Expanse, but
I haven't yet, no.
There's another, you should, it's great. New season coming soon, I think, so there'll be even more of it for you to binge when you get around to it. But I don't know, I think it's an odd title, The Expanse. Good episode, but a slightly odd title.
A really good episode, a cracking finale, to be fair. But it's a finale that's entirely about the next season, isn't it? All of it is about the next. And I suppose that's the point, isn't it? They're trying to build up expectation for the Delphic Expanse, and I think in that sense, but I mean, they could have gone with something.
Maybe in that sense it succeeds. Maybe you're right. It's like this is the season 3 is the Expanse opening out in front of us.
Maybe
just look what we've got planned. Yeah,
maybe, could be.
I don't know. Jumping over the next episode, the Xindi, fairly self-explanatory. Then we have Anomaly. Now, this obviously is the one with these spatial anomalies that are doing weird things to the ship. I think there's also an element there of this is an anomalous episode for Archer. This is the one where he basically waterboards a prisoner to try and get information out of them. And I do wonder if there's a sense that, you know, which is the real anomaly? Is it the kind of spatial anomaly, or is it the way the captain is behaving, you know, in a way that we do not associate with a Starfleet captain at all?
Yeah, that's true, actually. That is an interesting double meaning, definitely. I think it's funny because this third season sort of, it has some really interesting episodes that sort of break format at the same, but I always felt like they didn't, the way they established the anomalous stuff in the Expanse, the episode, it never felt like they got weird. I mean, that whole stuff they did in the Expanse, it really reminded me of Event Horizon, the film Event Horizon.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is really twisted,
I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But they never really do that then, you know, in the following season. I was always a little bit disappointed that we never got that truly twisted, bizarro, horrible episode with people being inverted and going loopy, and, you know, it was a shame. And so you don't really get it here. But at the same time, I think the whole stuff with Archer is very interesting. So I don't really mind in that sense, you know.
But you're right. It could have been more. They could have leaned into the horror a bit more, I suppose.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe that was what Brannon Braga had planned, and
could be
Rick Berman pulled him back a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, probably.
Followed by a truly terrible episode, Extinction. But I think it's worth mentioning because I think the title, it almost earns the episode its place, because I think a lot of people sort of think that this seems like one of these kind of random episodes that doesn't really further the arc at all. But I think it thematically does tie in, because there's this idea of extinction that kind of runs through the third season. You know, the humans are in danger of becoming extinct. The Xindi think they're in danger of becoming extinct. Everyone is kind of threatened with this potential for extinction. And here, quite early in the season, we have this race that have basically gone extinct, and the only way they're surviving is through this virus or whatever it is. I don't know, this idea of like trying to escape extinction sort of seems like a theme that is going to play out through the season. And so maybe for that reason, that episode kind of earns its place. And certainly the title kind of puts its finger on that somehow.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's a fairly average title, I suppose, in many ways. But yeah, thematically it works, even if, it is bad. I remember watching this and thinking, ooh, yeah, not good.
A couple of episodes down, we have Impulse, which is the closest we get to that kind of horror in the Expanse thing with the zombie Vulcans, basically. Yeah. Interesting to use that word, because obviously in Star Trek we think of impulse engines, but here I think, I assume it's the idea of this sort of out of control emotion. It's not exactly emotion. Yeah. They're not like Vulcans that have lost their self-control. I mean, I suppose you could say a zombie acts on impulse. I don't know.
Well, could it be a reference to sort of like impulse control as well as, you know, I don't know, some kind of twisted version of that, maybe, that they've just lost inhibitions and they you know, they haven't got any attachment to their control emotionally, which is what Vulcans always have. I'm not sure.
I think that's what it's getting at, but it's a slightly strange one, but I think it works. I don't know, maybe it's just because the episode is very memorable. It kind of, I don't know. You remember that's the right one somehow. I don't know. Why is that? What, you know, is there a link between impulse and fusion? And I don't know, these quite simple,
could be,
you know, but both quite sort of scientific sounding in some ways, but can kind of go either way, can't it?
Yeah, you could think about the engines. Definitely, you're absolutely right. It could be an episode about travel, you know, and that kind of thing. It could go either way, that one.
A few episodes down from there, we've got Twilight. A beautiful title. Quite a beautiful episode in some ways. I guess we have here sort of Archer in his Twilight years, and this is set in the future. We've also kind of got Earth, or not Earth, because Earth's gone, but, you know, the humans in their sort of Twilight years. Again, you know, picking up on this theme of extinction, these kind of people. I don't know, I guess it sort of conveys the sort of sadness of that world that the episode is kind of mainly taking place from within somehow.
Yeah, it's a nice title. Although it would immediately make everyone think of the movies, the Twilight movies.
Sadly,
although did they come later? I think they did. They did come after this, didn't they? But
did, yeah.
Retroactively. But it's still a nice title, and I think it's this episode's kind of, I suppose, the Enterprise version of like the Inner Light, isn't it? That kind of, you know,
or
that
the
kind of episode. Yeah, or the Visitor.
Kind of,
Definitely.
Exactly,
yeah, it's good. Yeah, it has that little element of mysticism or magic or strangeness to it, which I think the episode does have. Yeah, it's good.
Now, next up, we go from Twilight to a star, North Star. I really like this episode. I like the feel of it. It makes me think of the kind of star. I think maybe it makes me think of like the star of the sheriff's badge when you think of like a Fistful of Datas or just like a classic Western. But actually, when I looked it up, the North Star, I think, is a reference to the fact that slaves escaping from the South used the North Star as a reference point, basically, to guide them where to go, basically. So the North Star is specifically kind of, placed in the context of this, obviously this storyline where they're these oppressed peoples, basically, and it's kind of about their rights and their treatment and so on, is explicitly invoking kind of, slaves in the South trying to escape to the North, basically. So it's an interesting reference point there. Followed by Similitude, another sort of sciencey title. An interesting one, though, I think, because it's a little bit more, I don't know, it feels like it has a little bit more to it somehow. It's hard to tell. Maybe that's partly because it's such a great episode. Obviously, literally, it just really means similarity. But I think calling it Similitude rather than calling it similarity makes it sound more specific and more kind of high-tech and kind of, and so on. And obviously, this is about a symbiote who ends up being called Sim. So there's a kind of weird sense of, there's a similarity between the character and the title and everything. It sort of all feels of a piece somehow. So it sort of makes sense they go for that title.
Bit of a play on words in some ways, isn't it? And a play on the character name. Yeah, it's quite clever, actually, yeah.
Then we've got Proving Ground. Proving Ground is obviously a kind of military installation for testing weapons, which is essentially what we're seeing here. But it feels to me like a sort of, it definitely makes you think of, well, it makes me think anyway of sort of atomic weapons testing, maybe that kind of era. So I think, again, it's sort of guiding us back towards what the season is trying to do as a whole, which is to kind of move from this 9/11 allegory towards kind of World War II allegory and this Oppenheimer character with Degra. And to me, I think the word Proving Ground, I don't know, for me anyway, it kind of pushes you in that sort of, dropping atomic bomb territory somehow, which I guess sort of helps with that.
Yeah, I think there's also the idea of having to prove something to Shran, as well. And that level of, if not like competition between them, but that growing respect, that attempt to sort of use what's going on as a way of proving that they're on the same wavelength, and that they're trying to prove to one. Because Shran is all about that, isn't he? He's all about trying to prove his strength and about his and all that. So it's interesting. Yeah, it works on a couple of different levels. This one, it's quite good. It's a good episode as well.
Great episode. Yeah, Bikini Atoll was part of what was known as the Pacific Proving Grounds, according to Wikipedia. I think that's sort of what I'm thinking of. But yeah, great episode and good title too, I think. Harbinger. Now, this is the one where you've got the kind of alien, you've got the alien who they describe as being like a canary in the coal mine sort of thing. Obviously, a Harbinger sort of, we think of as something that announces a danger to come or a kind of threat to come. We usually think of it in quite a sinister way. Literally, a Harbinger comes from, I think, the same kind of root as the word harbour, and it was someone who was sent ahead to find safe harbour for whether for a ship or a fleet or whatever, or for an army. It would be the person who was sent ahead. So they would be a harbinger of that great force coming, which obviously is the idea with the sphere builders, that this one individual is going to be a sort of harbinger of a whole kind of invasion, or
harbinger of doom.
Exactly, a harbinger of doom, and of this sort of whole, species kind of encroaching into our space. But there's also, I don't know, I think there is an interesting sense that, the canary in the coal mine thing, it's trying to find an environment to live in. They're trying to make an environment to live in. It almost fits with this idea of that, the one that goes ahead to sort of seek out. There's I suppose the point about the harbinger is they're seeking out a place for their fellows to come and live in. Do you know what I mean? It's not just that they're not like a scout in a kind of military sense. They're seeking somewhere to live, and the kind of scouting out the living conditions somehow, which obviously fits very much with what the sphere builders are trying to do here.
It's quite good. It's quite a good title in that sense. Yeah, it's bit more evocative than some of these others.
Then we've got Doctor's Orders. Now, this is the one, I think, that is basically a retread of the Voyager episode 1. Much smarter title, I think, with 1. But I suppose it's a little bit punny insofar as, you know, the Doctor's been given his orders. Normally we think of Doctor's orders as coming from the Doctor. These are orders that have been given to the Doctor, and he's going to have to carry them out and kind of be the one in charge for the first time. So, you know, but kind of does what it says on the tin, I suppose.
But yeah, but they again are trying to sort of carry out. You could imagine these titles definitely applying to the Doctor in Voyager, though, as well, couldn't you? Like Dear Doctor was another one earlier in Enterprise. So they've almost carried, even though Phlox is a very different character, they've almost carried these whimsical-ish Doctor titles over to Enterprise.
You're right. It's interesting. We don't get episodes with the name Phlox in them, but we do get lots of episodes where Phlox is referred to as the Doctor.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I wonder if that's a kind of unconscious hangover somehow, which you didn't get with, you know, obviously you got Dr. Bashir, I presume. I don't think you'd ever get a Bashir episode that used the word Doctor without Bashir.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I don't think Dr. Crusher got Doctor episodes, if you know what I mean, or even McCoy. So that is an interesting point. Has the Doctor from Voyager kind of, you know, fed into that somehow, into the way that we kind of title Phlox episodes?
It could be. Maybe it's also because Phlox is a bit more of not a comedy character, but he's a bit more perky and dry and jokey than maybe, certainly Crusher was. Bashir was, but it was a bit different in his sense. And then obviously they play with some interesting stuff with him. So maybe they just feel like with the Doctor, particularly the Doctor, and also a little bit with Phlox, they can get away with more of these like play on Doctor as a title kind of titles. It's strange though. It is strange. Yeah. It feels like that. It definitely is a Voyager hangover for sure.
Now, a few episodes down, we've got the episode Damage, which I think again, it almost feels like a kind of counterpart to Anomaly, because it's the other episode where Archer does something kind of almost unconscionable. Obviously the ship is damaged almost beyond repair, it seems, by this point. But is this equally about the damage that it's doing to Archer, really having to act in this way? You know, the damage that he's doing as well, you know, to this other ship, I suppose. But I suppose there's a sort of spiritual damage as well as, you know, physical damage, and that's what we're going, you know, which is going to become a sort of story thread that gets picked up on over the ensuing episodes.
Yeah, and these kind of fairly to the point titles, I think, work, and Enterprise does a few of these good ones, like we talked about in season 3, because there is multiple, like Anomaly was the other one. There is multiple layers to it, whereas I think some of the previous ones in previous shows that have been a bit one word to the point, they don't really mean a lot, they just are quite technical, whereas with this, it's tapping a little bit more into the psychology of Archer, the character, so it works. It's a bit more effective.
A couple of episodes down, we've got E squared. Now, we had Q2 earlier. This time we've got a superscript E. It's not just... Now, I wondered about this. Why is it squared? I mean, what does it mean that we don't have Enterprise plus Enterprise? We've got Enterprise times Enterprise. What are we saying here? I don't know. Is there maybe Amy Nelson can give us some input on that? I mean, what's the significance of the fact that it's not just two of them? It's that it's squared. Except that I suppose it seems more. Maybe the fact that there's kind of time involved in it, and there's something kind of slightly trippy about what they discover. Finding their future selves and all this. I don't know. It's a good episode, I think. Interesting episode. And a strong title. But I suppose it also evokes like E equals MC squared, doesn't it? Somehow.
Yeah.
The fact that it's E squared. It's not Enterprise squared. It's, E squared. It seems like an equation.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's what it is. They're going for the hint of Enterprise with E, but they're also going for a recognisable, you look at that, you're going to think of an equation, you're going to think of maths, you're going to think of numbers. And I think they're looking for a fairly recognisable way of sort of trying to describe what this episode is, even though it doesn't. Yeah, I think maybe I get why they called it that, but it doesn't quite work, I don't think. But
I don't know. I think it's kind of a cool title.
It's okay.
It's easy to remember which episode it is. But yeah. Jumping ahead a little bit, we've got Stormfront. Again, another one of these fronts, these Cold War fronts. This is the kind of Man in High Castle version of it with the sort of alternate World War II outcome and so on. I don't know what to say about it more than that. I guess you've got the Storm. I don't know. Do you have like stormtroopers? Do you know what I mean? Something is that? I suppose that's what's being evoked there with the storm part. This is the storm front. We had the cold front. I can't remember if we had any other fronts.
They're going the cold front. They're going for a very sort of mixture of, I think, Nazi stormtrooper kind of thing and the temporal Cold War. Can I just very quickly though mention 0 Hour, which was the season 3 finale? I mean, it's almost a bit like an endgamey kind of title, isn't it? In some sense, 0 Hour, you know. But there is a film, a Canadian documentary film in 1944 called 0 Hour, which is about the Axis and Allied invasions that took place during the Second World War. So
really interesting.
It's in 0 Hour just really strikes me as well as like a very B movie kind of war or post, Cold War 50s sort of B movie title. You know, that whole idea of it's very schlocky actually for the end of a season, and I quite like it actually. I think it's quite epic in a sense. It's sort of suggesting something big is about to happen. I think again that plays into what we get at the end of the episode when we see the Nazi, the Nazi alien. It all factors, like you say, into this leaning back towards a World War II kind of play on that or allegory and that kind of thing. That's
an interesting point. Yeah, 0 Hour and before that Countdown, both of which sound like season finales. Great, two great episode titles. Yeah, very kind of action drama packed. I always remember the DVD for that season of Enterprise. For some reason, when they wrote the blurb, they'd written something about telling the whole story from Countdown to 0 Hour, by which they meant the countdown as in like the beginning of the story. But I thought it was very strange because obviously this sounds like, okay, this is the whole story of 2 episodes, in this season. You're going to get like an hour and a half worth of it. But yeah. No, definitely 2 good titles there. Picking up after Stormfront in season 4, of course, we get the very simple Home. Now, this could have been a title for Voyager's finale, you might think, if they hadn't gone with Endgame. I mean, since that's what the whole of Voyager has been obsessed with, this idea of getting home. Obviously, when Archer comes home is not quite what he hoped it might be, or he's not quite what he hoped he might be. So there's this kind of bitter element to it. But I think the fact that it's this very simple, very kind of, I was going to say homely, very kind of, appealing sort of warm title, there's a kind of irony there, just as there was in some ways, with Family for Picard, which obviously isn't about family, but you might think of family in a very sort of cozy. Most people think of the word family as a nice kind of warm, cozy sort of idea. And in fact, for Picard, it was much more anguished and difficult than that somehow. It's a very family-esque episode, though, in that sense, isn't it? They've come off the back of this massive, epic, traumatic, universe-destroying kind of thing. And now it's a very pastoral kind of episode where they just go back. It to some extent, a little bit like we've just had with Discovery, actually, as we record this, with Forget-Me-Not, which was a little bit more, about the crew trying to relax and settle a little bit and that kind of thing. So I think, it's a simple but fairly effective title. A rare sort of fairly obvious title for a season that really does try and stretch the titles a bit in this year, don't they? They're a little bit more interesting generally. I like it though. I like the simplicity of it because I think it's sort of. It's almost so simple that it kind of raises a question, if you know what I mean. It can't be that simple, and we know it can't by this point. Just jumping down a little bit, Cold Station 12, I think, is a fantastic sci-fi title. Definitely. Whatever the context, it's just great sort of feel to it. I mean, I really enjoy all these, all the kind of arcs in season 4, Borderland, the Augments, Awakening. I don't know. I think they're quite strong sci-fi kind of evocative titles. I don't think there's a huge amount to say about them necessarily, but they're strong titles either way. Although I have to say, I do struggle sometimes to remember what order do they go in? There's not necessarily. They feel like for each one of those episodes, they come up with 3 great titles, and you could they could almost be interchangeable in a lot of cases. Yeah. The standalones have great titles. I think some of them. Daedalus, obviously, for the the inventor who loses his son, Icarus. here we have the inventor of the transporter who loses his son to it. Then we've got Observer Effect, one of my favourite Enterprise episodes. And I guess this is the idea, the Observer Effect is the idea that the observer affects the scientific experiment. A bit like, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that you can't kind of observe something without, without kind of interfering with it. Here, though, in a way, it's almost the other way around, because it's actually the experiment that affects the observers, insofar as the observers are trying to be kind of clinical and detached. But witnessing the experiment actually changes them in some way and causes them. I suppose they do interfere. That's kind of the point. Is that Archer is sort of saying to them, this aloof attitude of not interfering and so on is wrong. Actually, with this kind of experiment, you should be interfering. You shouldn't be going for this kind of detached idea. But there's also this sense that the experiment has kind of influenced them, has changed them somehow.
Yeah, definitely. It's there's a flip aspect. I think you've described that really well. I like it. It's a really, really nice title, actually. Yeah, it really is. It's a play on an understandable term, and also it works on many levels. You're right about how the standalone episodes perhaps have more evocative titles than some of the the clusters. But yeah, it's very good.
The next little cluster, obviously kicked off by Babel 1. Now, obviously, this is a reference to both, the Tower of Babel in the Bible, but also more specifically the original series episode Journey to Babel, and the idea of the Babel Conference and so on. So that's, I suppose, that's sort of reference that works on both levels. But I think the within Star Trek reference point is the stronger one there for sure.
Definitely.
Jumping down a little bit through these next couple of mini arcs. Another standalone, not my favourite Enterprise episode, I have to say, Bound. I'm not quite sure what they were going for here. Is it a kind of S&M thing? Is it that sexy lesbian movie that the Wachowskis made after The Matrix? What exactly are they going for here with Bound? I mean, I feel like it's a terrible episode in pretty much every way. I kind of feel the title possibly makes it even worse somehow, because it really leans into that slightly sleazy, slightly kind of sketchy thing. And I don't even really know exactly what it means, to be honest.
I think they just wanted to get some women in, Orion women in, and just, I think they thought this kind of episode would be a bit of fun, and I think what the problem with Star Trek of this era is whenever they try and have a bit of fun, it's usually awful. Like, normally, you look at something like Fascination, for me anyway, I'm just like, oh God, no. Or, you just think,
quite like Fascination.
I know you quite like, that's why I said for me, because I know you quite like that one. But there are some really, and you just think, oh, please stop having fun. Just the fun comes from the episodes where they're not having fun in a way. I don't know. I just think that, Bound is not a good example of that. Absolutely,
no. Interesting you should mention these, the ones where they're just having fun. Because the next episode is one that most people love, and I don't have a huge amount of time for myself, In a Mirror Darkly. I would say, though, regardless of my reservations about the episode, it's a great title. I mean, we've previously had Alice in Wonderland for the Mirror Universe. We've had Snow White, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall for the Mirror Universe. Now we get 1 Corinthians for Now We See But Through a Glass Darkly, and then we shall see whatever it is, whatever the line is clearly, basically. And interestingly, the glass in that biblical quotation may be a glass or it may be a mirror. I mean, I think in this case, it's obviously being taken to refer to a mirror. So the idea that we see ourselves, darkly, we see ourselves distorted, we see a version of ourselves that's not kind of how we really are, which is very fitting for the Mirror Universe, I guess. I don't love these episodes at all. I think they're a complete waste of time, personally, mainly because they have no impact whatsoever on the characters that we're supposedly following. Somewhat, you could say, like These Are the Voyages, actually. There's almost a similar kind of disconnect from the Enterprise crew in them. But I know a lot of people love them, and I do think it's a great title.
It is a great title. I mean, they're not my favourite Mirror episodes by any means. I think they are... credit to them for trying something different, I think, for trying to just flip it over and maybe be slightly more ahead of their time in some sense, in that, you would get this later with, say, Fringe. that had its own sort of mirror universe, and they eventually had characters, two very different storylines playing out in two different universes, week by week, flip. And I know they didn't do that specifically with this, but I quite appreciate the idea that almost the title is a suggestion that we're looking through the dark mirror at this. We're not involved like the characters have been in things like Mirror Mirror or, you know, Shattered Mirror or whatever they are. In this case, we're just looking through the mirror at this world, you know, and I quite like that. I quite like that in a sense, but I can see why people would have their problems with it, yeah. And I think it's not the best, you know. I think my favourite's probably Through the Looking Glass. I really like that one, actually.
You mean that it's almost like a frame, the mirror that we're sort of seeing, like a one-way mirror, like in a police station,
exactly,
kind of thing.
Yeah,
I see. That's an interesting way of looking at it. And so it's in the mirror because it's in that universe. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe
whatever. What should have been the two-part finale for Enterprise, definitely. I think. Yeah. Two fantastic episodes, Demons and Terra Prime, and two great titles as well, because they both, I think, carry a kind of double meaning. Demons, because obviously there's this question of who are the demons? You know, are the demons the aliens? I mean, going back to the original series, we had Spock being described as being like a demon, you know, being like the devil. In fact, in this episode, it becomes pretty clear it's the humans that are the real demons. You know, a bit like you could say, going back to the Devil in the Dark, who's the real devil, with the humans are the real devils there. And then Terra Prime, you've got this great play on words with terror as in Earth and terror as in terrorism, because it's basically about a terrorist organisation. So two really clever titles, I think, for two fantastic episodes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they absolutely should have been the end of Enterprise. And yeah, I think... Yeah, that they bring in that grounded sense, you know, obviously with Terra, literally as well. There's a grounded sense of very Earth-based stuff with this. And, you know, if you like Demons, you know, a very sort of an almost religious connotation, and that element of, you know, you don't always get with Star Trek. I don't know. I think they are good. They are very simple and basic in some senses, but they work. But yeah, they should have been. Even though I do like the title of the next one coming up. That these should have been the finale, 100%.
The final episode, obviously, these are the Voyagers. You're right. Terrible episode for my money.
Yeah, it is.
Great title. And it's a great title, and it fits very much with one of the few things that is really good about that episode is the literally like last 5 seconds where we get that kind of montage of all the Enterprises, and we get the, you know, for the first time since Next Gen went off the air, we get that whatever you call it, that little speech that we get, you know, in the original series, A Next Generation, which has proved so influential, actually, that I was trying to count the number of Star Trek episodes that have kind of riffed off that. We've got, we don't have one called Space, as far as I can think, which is a shame. And we've had like Night and stuff, but I think they could do it in an episode just called Space. Obviously, the X-Files had an episode called Space. But we've had The Final Frontier, obviously. We've had... this one, These Are the Voyages. We've had Strange New Worlds, to explore Strange New Worlds. We've had the New Civilization in Enterprise. And obviously we've had both Where No Man Has Gone Before and Where No One Has Gone Before. So 6 times Star Trek has plundered its own little voiceover intro for episode titles in the course of, you know, whatever it is, how many years will we be out here? Like 40-ish, I guess, years by this point. And obviously, as we said, with Strange New Worlds coming down the pipeline, obviously, you know, there may be more. Who knows? I mean, there aren't many words left to extract from that, I suppose. No. Seek out new life. Maybe you could get something out of that bit. I don't know. I feel like they kind of got most of it there by now.
They do.
An interesting marathon, I suppose. They're kind of like... you know, Captain's Intro marathon where you watch all those episodes together.
Yeah, that'd be good. I feel like
in
the
that
final
order. You know?
Yeah, in the order. Yeah,
in the order that they come in the speech. Yeah.
I feel like The Final Frontier could be a title that gets repurposed one day as well. You know, I mean, we've only ever had that once, and it's been years ago. I could well imagine a future Star Trek show being called The Final Frontier. Yeah, you know, that would be really good. Or the premiere episode of a series, you know, something like that. But we'll see. This is a great title, though. It is. It's a shame the episode's terrible, but it's really evocative. It's really nice. And in terms of the flawed attempt at what they were trying to do to cap off an era, I think and cap off the first 40 years, if you like, even though, I think These Are the Voyages is a nice title in that respect. It's just a shame that it's just a terrible finale, as I know we've discussed elsewhere, but it's a great title.
It makes sense as well, because it is, it makes perfect sense with the fact that it's from the perspective of Riker and so on. And these are, they are watching Star Trek, so they would get the the meta text around Star Trek. Exactly. If you know what I mean? These are the Voyages. Is that line is speaking to the audience, isn't it? It's not. Do you know what I mean? It's almost breaking the fourth wall when they say that. These are the Voyages. It's telling you this is what this TV show is about, and the only person who can say that is. We get it in Lower Decks in the finale there, don't we? With Riker coming back and saying, I was, doing the holodeck of the Enterprise crew again, what great guys they were, getting from here, going from there to here. It's a phrase that exists outside of Star Trek, and yet it finds a way to sort of exist within Star Trek by having Star Trek watching Star Trek. So it does, as much as the episode itself makes almost no sense, the title makes perfect sense for once.
Absolutely.
Well, we made it through to, the end of Star Trek, as we thought for many years, through many, many decades. And obviously we'll pick up next time with some of the more recent ones. We might wait a little while and see if we can get at least, I don't know when the right time would be to wait for, but since we're at the moment bang in the middle of Discovery season 3, it might make sense to at least wait until the end of that season so we can check. Although I think all the episode titles have been leaked, including one very surprising episode called Unification 3.
Unification. I knew you were going to say that.
Intrigued. That one, and then also the fact that Hope Is You Part 1 doesn't appear to have a Part 2 yet.
What's that about?
And I don't know whether... I think Part 2 is going to be the opening of Season 4.
Yeah, maybe.
And I base that partly on just... That seems to make sense to me. But also the director, Olatunde Osunsanmi, tweeted that they'd started principal photography on that episode, and I replied cheekily saying, "Is that Hope Is You Part 2?" And he liked my tweet. Now I don't know if that's non-disclosure agreements and so on being what they were. I don't know if that is that is exactly binding or anything, but it at least struck me he'd obviously seen that and thought that was a decent suggestion. So if it's not the premiere, could be the finale. Who knows? Could be the series finale. They must have a plan for it, though. You don't put out a part 1 with no part 2 without there being something going on there. So they've got something in mind. Obviously, it might turn out to be the season finale for part 3 and for season 3, and they've just we've got reviews, or maybe there's an extra episode because they have put in extra episodes in previous seasons before. It'd be odd for them not to mention it. Maybe it's a short trek. Who knows? But
we'll find out. It's
an intriguing title. Definitely putting a part 1 without a part 2 is a pretty good way of intriguing your audience with your titles.
Absolutely.
So we'll see whether that's a mystery that gets solved anytime soon or not.
Be fun to come back and do the new set. I mean, Discovery has got some fantastic ones, like the Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry and all these things. That would be fun to come back and do at some point.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, until we meet again for some of those exciting new titles, Tony, it's been a pleasure as ever having you on to chat about some of these names, these titles. Before you go, why don't you let our listeners know where they can find you online and what else you've been up to recently? Oh, well, that would take another 2 hours if I go through all that. But in short... I'd say check out 2 places. My Twitter probably is the best at AJ Blackwriter, and my podcast network, We Made This, at wemadethispod.com. There you'll find all the different things going on with me. Brilliant. Thanks again for joining me, Tony, and see you next time. Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, Babel, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC, and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended all right.